Translation Tour focuses on the question of why translations of the Bible differ from each other and why it matters. We have to start with a big idea, and that is there's not just one reason that English translations of the Bible differ from each other. It's not just because translators change things to make them fit their own agenda, and in fact, English translations of the Bible differ for a variety of reasons. The first reason is actually the most complicated one. Not all Bible translations start from the same source. So here's a key idea, an important idea that might upset some of you if you've never heard of it before. We actually don't have the originals of biblical books. What we have instead are copies, some of which are copies of copies, and not all the ancient copies of a biblical book are exactly the same. Some of the differences will make a difference. Some of them are relatively small. And it is a very technical field to study how these differences between the copies work. It's called textual criticism. If you'd like to know more about it, you can read the essay about it in the back of your new Oxford Annotated Bible Edition 4. Here's a key piece of information. We'll talk about the New Testament as written in Greek and the Old Testament as written in Hebrew. Let's start in talking about the textual issues by starting with the New Testament. In the case of the New Testament, most of the differences are actually between copies of New Testament books. We call these copies manuscripts because they were handwritten. The New RSV, in its notes, not the annotations that are at the bottom of the page, but the notes which are keyed by letters, in those notes, the New RSV will call those manuscripts ancient authorities. So stop for just a minute, go to Luke chapter 11 verses 1 through 13 in the New RSV, and look at the notes and see what they say about ancient authorities. Come back after you've done that. Here are a couple of images to give you a sense of what translators are working from. This is one of the oldest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, or complete manuscripts. It's called Codex Vaticanus because it's stored at the Vatican Library in Rome. Most of the manuscripts, however, are much more fragmentary, like a scrap of an old manuscript called P1. If you study Greek, you could learn how to read these manuscripts. When we turn to the Old Testament, the issues are a little bit more complicated. Almost all translators of the Old Testament start with Hebrew manuscripts that we call the Masoretic text. You can learn about that by reading in the early materials in the New Oxford Annotated Bible. The Masoretic text is what we usually think of as the Hebrew Bible in its original, but it's not the oldest manuscripts or copies of the Old Testament that we have. And in fact, the Hebrew text, the Old Testament books, were very early on translated into languages other than Hebrew, such as Greek, and the most important version of that is called the Septuagint. They were also translated into Syriac. And these early translations are called the versions. I apologize that some words are going to get used to talk about different things. It is true that we have the New Revised Standard Version. In that case, it means a translation. But in this case, when we talk about versions with a capital V, we're talking about those ancient translations of the Old Testament into languages like Greek or Syriac. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, beginning in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and continuing to somewhat be found today, translators also could compare the manuscripts, or the Masoretic text, They could repair it with the Qumran manuscripts, or abbreviated Q. And you'll see here, it's not my fault that Q is used to refer to different things in biblical studies. That means that when you see a textual difference in an Old Testament text, that it will look a little bit different than it did with the New Testament text. You won't find in the Old Testament notes that talk about ancient authorities. Instead, you'll find notes that, if it's a textual note, a note that has a colon in the middle. The word to the left of the colon will tell you on what the translators based their translation. Did they use the Greek? Did they use the Masoretic text? Did they use the Syriac? Did they use the Qumran manuscripts? The words after the colon will tell you what they decided against. And usually there's a reason they want you to know what they compared and what they chose. So stop your video for a minute, go look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, and look at the many examples of textual notes in the New RSV. Here's some nice visuals as well. This is a copy of a Masoretic text manuscript. Here's a copy from the Septuagint, which again is the Greek translation, in this case of the book of Leviticus, that was done very early, probably even the 2nd century. Here's one example of a Qumran manuscript, a Dead Sea Scroll. This one's pretty complete, although many of the Dead Sea Scrolls are just small fragments. Think of how this information would be one reason why some of the translations you know about are different from each other. The King James Version, which was translated in 1611, couldn't have used the Dead Sea Scrolls. They weren't found yet. And not all the Greek New Testament manuscripts that are currently consulted were available to the King James Version. That means that sometimes translations are going to change because people's understanding of the language changes over time. The Revised Standard Version, which was the big translation of the 1950s, also couldn't use the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the New Revised Standard Version, which came out in the late 80s, actually could use the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you were following along with our example from 1 Samuel 1, you'll see that it used the Qumran comparisons quite a bit. So up until this point, we've noticed that one reason that translations differ from each other is they don't have the same starting point. We now move to a second reason that translations differ. Once the translator decides what to translate from, the translators also have to decide and agree about what philosophies, what approaches they'll have in moving from one language to another. In the case of the Old Testament, we're talking about Hebrew. I should have mentioned there's a little bit of the Old Testament that's in the language of Aramaic. In the case of the New Testament, we're talking about Greek. The first big question that a translator has to answer is, am I going to tell the reader what it actually says, or am I going to tell them probably what it means? That is, do I try to do it as word for word as possible, or do I try to do it idea to idea? Two words help us to distinguish these two different approaches. Formal correspondence is an approach that tries to be as close as possible to telling you what the words actually say. So they tend to go almost a word at a time from Hebrew or Greek into English to give you a flavor of the original. On the other hand, dynamic equivalence tries to do it more idea for idea and to tell us what it means. Dynamic equivalence translations are usually easier to understand because what they're trying to do is to help you understand what it means. They're not very good, however, for helping you understand what the words actually say in the other language. That's one reason. Another reason that translations differ in terms of this reason of translational theory is that translators also have to decide what style of English they want. Do they want very formal sounding language? Do they want to sound like the King James? Or do they want something fairly simple, as if you were talking to someone on a street corner? Yet a third consideration is what reading level the publisher is targeting and the translator is targeting. How fancy, how many big words should you use? Should you write at a 5th grade reading level, a 10th grade reading level, somewhere in between? And what about non-native speakers of English? Should the English itself be simple so that folks don't have to know a lot of big words? Next, we turn to gender sensitivity. As you know, in the 1970s and 1980s, many theorists and average people began to recognize that words like man and he are pretty gender specific. Even though we've been told they're gender neutral, that may or may not be true for the past, but it's not true for the present. So many of us try to use inclusive language, especially for people, trying to recognize that when we say he, most people think about men. So there's a difference in translators about what they're going to do about gendered words. Are they going to pay lots of attention to gender in the biblical text? Will they treat a generic word, will they translate it as man, or will they say human? I've saved this one for last because most people think it's the only reason that translations differ, and that is theological perspective. I'll start at the bottom of my slide and want to underline this maybe 4 times. That translators rarely change the text to match their own theology. Let's say it again. Translators rarely change the text to match their own theology. That is, they're not explicitly trying to make the Bible say what they want it to say. And yet, when there are multiple legitimate options for translation, it is true that knowing the theological perspective of your translation committee will be important. For example, if it is a Roman Catholic committee, it might be guided in one way, whereas if it were a conservative Christian inerrantist view, it might be guided in another. How can you see some of this in the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and particularly in the New Revised Standard Version? Translation notes, not textual notes that we talked about before, but true translation notes are often, though not always, signaled with the word or. What is in the note is another possibility for the translation that's in the text. It's another option for what the translators have put in the text. Stop and look at the New Revised Standard Version translation of Genesis chapters 1 through 3. Notice this case of a translation option. What is another way Genesis 1:1 could be translated? Look at the note in chapter 1 verse 27, which is just telling you what the Hebrew word Adam literally means in English. Sometimes, as in chapter 3 verse 23, the note will tell you when the Hebrew words change. As you may know, and as we'll talk about in the second half of our class, the issues of gender and sexuality are big deals in Genesis 1 through 3, and the new RSV translators are trying to give you some information to explain the basis of their translation. Come back when you've had a chance to look at those. So where does that leave us? No one translation is going to be the best for everything. Some are going to be easier to read. Some are going to be closer to the original language. Some are going to fit theological perspectives better. And that's why it's helpful to have some resources that will help you sort through these various criteria. I've put a resource document on Moodle that's called Bible Translation Guide. It's put out by the Cokesbury Publishers. There are others online that you can find as well, but that's one way in which you can kind of scope out the differences between translations. But if you're ever confronted with a situation where you don't have the chart or a new translation is put into your hand, you can also find out lots about the translation by going to the preface in the Bible translation itself. For example, in the front of the New RSV, which is included in our New Oxford Annotated Bible, there's a preface from the translators that told you what the principles of translation are. You could find the same thing in most print editions of other translations, such as the New International Version, King James, others. What are you supposed to do with all this information? Let's talk about your translation assignment. I really want to underscore this. Without knowing the languages and the principles of text criticism, you aren't in a good position to make the decision about what the best translation was, much less what the original actually says. This is an understatement. There's more to it than just choosing the one that makes the most sense. So our goal in this assignment is not to decide which translation of Luke is the right one. Instead, your assignment is to see the differences for yourself, to compare at least 2 to 3 translations and to see how they compare. It's probably best to compare at least one formal equivalence translation and at least one dynamic equivalence translation, and to reflect on the differences that you see. My advice is to see if you can find 1 or 2 that really make a difference, and then talk a little bit about why it matters. Why would it matter if you knew which translation was right and which was in the original? As always, of course, if you have more questions, ask.